Welcome everybody to our ComAI lecture today, which is at the same time part on the sustainability lecture series of the Faculty Cultural Studies, with our guest of today, Arne Hintz from Cardiff University, one of our long-term cooperation partners. For everybody who does not know it, there's a so-called Bremen-Cardiff alliance between University of Bremen and Cardiff University. Arne is a reader at the Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Culture, and at the same time director of the postgraduate program and co-director of the Data Justice Lab, so this research unit of the school and Cardiff we are closely cooperating with. I think many of you know him from his publications, therefore I only want to highlight one book, which is my most favorite publication, by Arne Hintz. He wrote it together with Lina Denschik and Karin Wall-Jorgensen with the title Digital Citizenship in a Datafied Society. So really one of the publications which pushed the academic discussion about processes of datafication forward. Now we are not only living in the age of datafication, but in the age of communicative AI. So this is what we want to focus here in this lecture series. And Arne Hintz will speak about deciding about communicative AI, governance, participation, and social justice. Welcome to Bremen, the first years.
Thank you very much. Hello. Guten Abend. So, yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me to Bremen. Also, thanks a lot for allowing me to talk in English, even though I am from Germany, but like I have been working on these issues in Cardiff and other places internationally. And so I wouldn't know where to start if I were to present something on these issues in German. So it's quite useful. Yeah, I lived in Hamburg actually a long time ago, quite close to Bremen. Came through Bremen a few times, but clearly not often enough. And yes, as you've heard, there is now a strong cooperation, alliance between Bremen and Cardiff. I was hoping to spend a little bit more time here as part of that. There was also a longer visit arranged a few years ago, and as it happened then for so many of us, and of course, COVID came and all that was unfortunately out of the window, but maybe another time. Anyway, I'm here now and I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I'm based, and let me just maybe change that. I'm based at Cardiff University in the UK. And as you've heard there, I co-founded and co-direct a research center, the Data Justice Lab, that's exploring the datafication of society and implications for social justice. I also run the PhD program and a few other things. But what I want to talk here today about is really based on work of the lab. And so, well, that's basically what I share with you today. I mean, probably a few other things in between, but basically I just like to say a few words at the beginning about the Data Justice Lab, about this little institution that we created there and what it does, and maybe, yeah, also as some necessary background to know where we're coming from and what we're doing. Our approach to datafication and AI then, and what the intersections are with work, perhaps also on communicative AI. We haven't used that concept as much as colleagues here in Bremen, and so therefore, I mean, we're still a little bit based in kind of the slightly older discourse around datafication and yes, data, and so it will be very interesting to also use this talk or this discussion maybe later to draw some of the connections, to explore some of these connections. And then I would like to explore the specific research topic that I've focused on most recently, which is the question of public engagement with and civic participation in the governance of data and AI. And hopefully this will then tell us something about, perhaps about the future of communicative AI. We'll see. That might be a question at the end for, or a bit later for a discussion. And I'll be very interested to hear what everybody here has to say, or some people here have to say about this. So actually, even before the Data Justice Lab, I thought I'd start with just a few more words about myself, just so that you know where I'm coming from and how I got to work on these issues, because we all have different trajectories, all have different directions where we're coming from, and that often very much influences how we approach a subject and what issues we focus on and what goals we have also, perhaps. So my particular research trajectory focused very much on people's participation in the media in the early years of my career, at least. Questions of participation in the media, looking at community radio by marginalized communities, looking at citizen journalism, online activism, self-organized digital infrastructures, and so on. Part of that was at some point an interest in WikiLeaks. This is a book that I put together with some friends and colleagues about 10 years ago, just as an example. But part of that was also an interest in how policy can enable all this, and also restrict it in some cases, and how people can participate not just in media making, but also in policy making. And that included interest in multi-stakeholder policy processes, the involvement of civil society, of non-state, non-business actors in the development of policy and in decision-making, and debates around more inclusive forms of communication governance. Here's actually another book from that strand of work that just came out a few weeks ago. Again, with some colleagues and friends, that explores current dynamics in these areas. Thematically quite different, but some connections certainly within based on an interest on questions of participation, inclusion, involvement. But increasingly, all this has focused on datafication, first more on surveillance, and then on other ways in which data collection, data analysis are becoming an increasing part of our social fabric, and have a variety of implications, for example, on state-citizen relations, as we discussed on this book a few years ago that was already mentioned. And so all this addresses how people can participate in not just the shaping of media, but the shaping of the regulatory environment, of citizenship, and more widely, society. And so questions of agency are important here, and the social shaping of technology, which might give you some idea about where I'm coming from, but also where I'm going with this perhaps now in the next few minutes. The Data Justice Lab is a space that some of us created at Cardiff to explore the relations between datafication and social justice. Here you can see the 4 current directors, or, well, maybe what we looked like a few years ago, quite a few years ago. Let's not dwell on that. Let's stick to the illusion that this is still who we are. Anyway, how do we define data justice? What does it mean for us? In a publication a few years ago, we defined it like this: an analysis of data that pays particular attention to structural inequality, highlighting the unevenness of implications and experiences of data across different groups and communications in society. According to this perspective, the rollout of data and AI has deep implications for social justice. Who can cross the border? Who gets healthcare? On what terms? Who goes to prison? And so on. Data is not collected about everyone in the same way, and the implications are not the same for everyone. There are deep inequalities as to how we can resist also and respond and engage with these questions. And at the lab, we've tried to contribute to this increasingly prominent debate over the past few years, and in several ways. Of course, being a kind of research center based at the university, we've been working on a number of publications, including journal articles, journal special issues, and also a couple of books recently. That's the most recent one from last year, Data Justice, where we bring some of these debates together. We've also been working on non-academic reports that are targeted at other communities, targeted the general public or specific decision makers or specific stakeholders. For example, here, this one is a public sector guidebook that's targeted to public sector professionals who are interested in engaging the public in questions of data use and AI use. And on that subject, actually, we're holding a workshop series right now, bringing together in a kind of a series of events people who are working at local authorities, local councils in the UK, and who are responsible for questions of data use and AI use, and who are kind of debating in that group in these workshops on how to involve the public in these questions and in these debates. Yes, we also published this public-facing websites, datafightsociety.org, which summarized some of the arguments from a recent report on democratizing datafication and data governance, some of the issues that I will also be talking about here. Anyway, just to show you like a range of issues that we try to address here, and a range of communities and target groups. Also, we have organized 3 data justice conferences over the past few years, each with over 100 papers rather presented. Yes, also some practitioner workshops involved, not just academic paper presentations. And we conducted a number of externally funded projects, and here I just list a few of them. There have been others across the lab, but these include some particularly that address the question of data use and AI use in the public sector, in government, local government, national government, and so on, and then questions of civic participation and engaging the public. And here on the right side, that is a report, quite a long one, about this topic that we issued last year, particularly as an output of this project over there towards democratic auditing. And I will talk more about this a little bit later. Okay, so this has been a long introduction, but I thought it might be useful to give a bit of context. Then, datafication, the datafied society. Where are we coming from when we address contemporary developments in data and AI? So as we all know, probably data analytics and AI are being rolled out not just in the commercial sector and platforms, but across public services, across government. The most far-reaching project that was in the media quite a lot over the years was the Chinese social credit score. I don't know if I need to introduce that, but yeah, kind of a system and kind of a pretty far-reaching attempt of collecting data about people's diverse areas of life and making that in a way useful for decision-making about the services they have access to and the interventions that they might face. But scoring systems are emerging and have been emerging in the West too. For example, the use of data scores in the criminal justice system. There was an early example for controversy, the use of risk assessment of people that are arrested to predict and rate the likelihood of them committing a future crime and thereby inform sentencing. A lot of controversies happened about that. But more broadly, we have other areas, a number of other areas. Data about the living conditions of children is compiled to create a risk assessment for the child and assess when public authorities should intervene. Data about refugees is compiled to create risk scores to find out whether someone is supposedly a genuine refugee. Predictive analytics are used in predictive policing to understand where best to deploy police or in the health sector to allocate medical resources. And typically, these don't replace decisions, human decisions. They're not always pure forms of automated decision-making, but they inform and thus heavily affect human decisions. And one of our recent projects at the lab was to find out to what extent scoring systems and other similar forms of data analytics are used in the public sector in the UK, where we are based. So we looked at cases where local authorities in the UK have compiled large amounts of data about inhabitants, covering vast areas of personal life and what some have called a data warehouse. Those are actually terminology by people working there at local authorities, or data lake, or the golden view of citizens. Police forces also use data for predictive policing, of course. And in various areas, people are segmented into categories based on a variety of data points, like in the data categories of the company Experian. That's a commercial enterprise that assesses every household according to a wide variety of data points and sells this analysis to many clients, including businesses and platforms, but also public authorities and parts of government. This is just a kind of a small section, a small snippet of some of these categories that they use for to categorize the public. And so what this means is that growing areas of public administration are based on, or at least informed by, the aggregation of that data for the purpose of profiling, categorizing, sorting, rating, ranking, and segmenting and assessing, in a way, populations, and then treating them distinctly. And decisions on public service provision and interventions by the state are increasingly based on that. So there have been many concerns about this, of course, and I won't go through all of these here, but just a couple of key areas that have included, specifically then, biases and inequalities in how people are assessed through data and how they are treated then, sometimes also through automated systems, sometimes also through AI systems, and the harms that emerge from this, such as stigmatization and discrimination and others. We might add the ideology of dataism that has been discussed a bit over the past 10 years, which is the unquestioned belief in what the data says, and in data as a legitimate way of understanding and categorizing the world. But also, questions of accountability and transparency have been highlighted. The fact that the public typically know very little about what is happening, both in terms of the data collection and then how the data is analyzed, and then how data is used, often then through AI systems. And this is quite important, I would say, for what I want to talk about from here on. To start with, on that point, actually, it might be useful, maybe this slight detour, but nevertheless, it relates to some of the perspectives that we've used also on this subject. It might be useful to consider the broader debate on digital citizenship. Also because the book was mentioned, why not? So it's been quite prominent, this discourse, over not just a few years, but a couple of decades at least. I include here just a few references of some of the writings, some of the different approaches, some of the praises of digital citizenship. So typically, the idea of digital citizenship has been that it's focused on people's self-determination, the self-determination of citizens through the use of digital acts, the creation of your own citizenship, not as status, but as practice. A kind of do-it-yourself citizenship, as was proposed here by Barato and Bola. And that's been quite prominent, quite strong in this discourse. The focus on the active citizen, right? But what does that mean then in a context of datafication and AI use. Already mentioned questions of accountability and transparency. Well, what are some of the issues? If we are continuously profiled and categorized and our performance as citizens is permanently assessed and evaluated, this means power is conferred onto the data collector and the analyst and the developer of AI systems and so on, not necessarily the citizen, right? So we can actually ask whether there might be, rather than empowerment, as has been argued by scholars of digital citizenship for a long time, whether there is some disempowerment happening here. Accountability and transparency, I already mentioned that. Scoring and other types of data analysis and types of automation. All this takes place mostly without the knowledge of those being scored, without the knowledge of those being analyzed, and how this is done often remains pretty obscure. We may remember, for example, a critique by scholar Pasquale about the black box society and many other concerns around that field. So we are increasingly classified according to criteria that we don't know about, with consequences that we don't know about, and without an open way of redress. Scoring and other forms of predictive analytics use information about past events to predict our behavior for the future, right? That's basically how it works. But what this means, if we look at it from a social perspective, is it creates a static image of society. What happened before will happen again. And it leaves little space for change and for people's own agency. It's really very, very useful in a way as a means for management of the citizenry to steer it along predictable paths, but maybe less so to account for or enable change and people's own agency. Some scholars have looked at this in the context of smart citizenship, in the context of research on smart cities, so where the citizen is invited to often select from different services, and there's a lot of that selection taking place, but that's it really. That's the only agency that people are supposed to have. And so going back to digital citizenship, what about then the claims of empowerment? As I said, we see a lot of references to disempowerment, to, for example, as Draper and Turo has called it, digital resignation. In surveillance studies, people talk about the chilling effect, and all that raises some problems, right? For kind of the more enthusiastic claims of empowerment in the context of digital citizenship. So perhaps now we should pause for a moment and ask what all this has to do with communicative AI, because as you've heard, yes, I haven't been talking about communication. I certainly haven't been talking about ChatGPT or other specific tools. Communication in a more narrow sense, we might say, but about administrative decisions. And not about AI actually, but about data mostly. But it is about communicative processes that are automated or semi-automated and that were previously associated with humans. Decision-making, for example, about the eligibility of social services. And in some cases then communicating such decisions to recipients. Those are, I would say, kind of point to transformations of societal processes when state-citizen relations are informed, in some cases we might even say determined, by data analysis and automated or semi-automated service provision and intervention. And so we're talking about, in that sense, maybe communicative AI as a foundation of social, in a wider sense perhaps, and as a foundation for social change anyway. which concerns implications for individuals, like discrimination, for example, the interaction between individuals and governments. If we think about citizen scoring, as we've called it, the allocation of public services, and so on, and also more broadly, society. For example, there's been some work on challenges to the welfare state because of individualized database assessment. And so I've been talking about data, and I will continue because I'm kind of a little bit talking based on the research that we've conducted. But I think there are some connections that would certainly be good to explore further at the end of it. And yes, I'm coming to this from a certain vantage point, as we all are. The vantage point of the Data Justice Lab. And so back to the points on citizenship and participation. For us, this raised several questions. How do we participate as citizens in decisions on how data systems and AI are developed and applied? How do we intervene, particularly in the deployment of data systems in government and the public sector? And that is, after all, where state-citizen relations are affected most severely. Or in other words, how do we intervene into the processes that increasingly organize society? How do we advance civic agency and democracy in the governance of data and AI? And this is not just a technical or administrative question, but it's a deeply democratic question, a political question, right? It's about participation in key decisions that are transforming society. And at the same time, it's about participation in debates about data and AI, and the norm building around data and AI, how we think about data and AI. So, what do we need to do? A range of concepts and practices have been proposed and discussed, and we explored some of them in our recent projects on civic participation in the datafied society and democratizing the datafied society. Is just a brief overview of those two projects that I'm basically looking at here and that I'm reporting from. In case you're interested, so we looked at, particularly in the first one, we looked at different dimensions and avenues for public engagement with decision-making on data and AI, different levels, different areas, what is happening within institutions and particularly local government, is what we looked at. What are different models and methods of civic engagement? Are there forms of participatory oversight? Advisory bodies? What about civil society campaigns, civil society strategies? What is the role of alternative imaginaries and different ideas about data and AI and how we think about them, how we talk about them, and of course, the question of literacy. And in the more recent project, we focused a little bit more than on particularly affected communities. What is actually the impact for marginalized communities, for people with fewer possibilities to respond actively, and what are ways of responding there, what are practices of responding, and this is still ongoing. This is still something that we're working on. Now, just to go through some of these and then focus on one particularly. Maybe to start with one that is actually not included here, but of course is the starting point in many ways when we talk about questions of AI. It is technological transparency. That's an important precondition, of course. And there's been some work on auditing algorithms and so on, and this is also reflected in policy and as part of the GDPR. Yeah, but it also has limitations that it requires individuals to engage on their own. And that's, as we know probably from our own lives, that's not always easy and that's not always realistic to expect. So what is then important what are ways to to advance that. Well, data literacy has been discussed as one key area of engagement and of work, and there have been also recent attempts to move beyond the focus on practical skills of using data, which was kind of the starting point, towards a more critical engagement and understanding with datafication more broadly and with the role of AI in society. And I just put down a few references, a few quotes here. Some of this, this more critical perspective, more recent perspective, included also engagement with the understanding of the political economic context of datafication, the business models and infrastructures and predominant logics, and empowerment. Then with a goal towards empowerment, towards practical intervention into the workings of the datafied society. And so literacy then should mean, according to these scholars, to, for example, here, Kami, to develop critical thinking about the online ecosystem to empower people to become active citizens. Or, according to Sanna, who was actually a PhD student with our group at Cardiff, what is the goal here? She says to understand and critically reflect upon the ubiquitous collection of personal data and the possible risks and implications that come with these big data practices. And actually, Carmi and colleagues use the term citizenship again, data citizenship, for this to enable, with the goal to enable proactive citizen participation, enable citizens to to challenge, object, and protest contemporary power asymmetries manifested in datafied societies. So there's some work on that. Okay, but that still doesn't show us the vehicles and avenues, we might say, for actual intervention. Civil society campaigns have been important for that, for advancing digital rights, data rights, but they too have limitations, in part because they typically focus on specific issues, and in part because the legacy in a way of a distinction between digital rights digital rights and social justice, which is not so strong anymore, but still these are discourses that coming on kind of goals that come from different perspectives sometimes, but also because they mainly intervene from the outside, of course, and they're not an institutionalized part of decision making. So what would then be institutional avenues? Well, consultations, maybe classic ones, as part of government, local government sometimes. But in our research, we could see that there are few of those. They typically don't have much impact, and there's a widespread view that they're not really necessary, or the claim that people are not really interested in having a say about these kind of things. So what else? Now, in the remaining minutes, I want to talk about one specific aspect of that research that, in a way, moves us out of the sphere of digital and AI and into, in a way, classic political science, but might be interesting to bring in some of this perspective. And that is models and methods of public engagement with questions of data and AI. And it's based on a political science concept, in a way, of democratic innovation, which includes new processes, models, and practices that advance citizen voices in decision-making outside and beyond the classic processes of elections. That includes popular assemblies, what has been described as mini-publics. Those are initiatives typically that bring together a small selection of the population for deliberation on a key issue that society is facing. There are different models. There are citizen juries and citizen assemblies, deliberative polls, citizen summits, distributed dialogues and all kinds of different slight differences in these methods. And they're complemented then by other forms of democratic innovation that are used in other circumstances, like participatory budgeting, for example, and others. And yeah, all these, again, bring together a limited number of citizens, sometimes randomly selected, which is the classic idea of mini-publics, sometimes recruited to represent the diversity of a population for a few days, typically of deliberation, with expert input provided to teach participants about the issues. And in the end, they make proposals, sometimes they make decisions on the issues they have discussed. Typically, it's proposals to kind of affect, guide policy-making, decision-making. And this has generated some significant interest, actually, in recent years, as demonstrated in a way also by this recent OECD report that is conspicuously titled Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions Catching the Deliberative Wave. And we have seen probably, recently, like in the last few days, I think there were also some examples in the news about how this is now used in various areas of society on key questions that people are facing and that countries are facing. There have been actually a number of interesting international cases where mini-publics have been used quite successfully, sometimes in local and city development, or sometimes for the amendment also, or development even, of new constitutions, like in Ireland there was a case, or in Iceland. Actually, that picture up here on the left is from Iceland, one of the many deliberative activities over the past 10, almost 15 years now that discussed and developed a proposed new constitution. The constitution has been there for a long time, but it's not implemented yet. But that's another question. But many of these citizen assemblies, juries, deliberative polls, and so on have been organized to elaborate on aspects of that new constitution. And increasingly, these methods have also been used for questions of data and AI. On the top right, we can see just a picture of meetings as part of the Oakland Surveillance Technology Ordinance in the US, which gives citizens a voice in police use of surveillance technology. There have been other examples in the US about things like that. And similar methods have also been applied to questions of data and AI use in the UK. On the issue of health, for example, there have been a number of citizen juries on questions of data sharing, the use of AI in health, also in treatment, and so on, to get, in part then to get a better understanding under what circumstances people would prefer that, accept this, what they think about it, and so on, and where they would draw the line. Here at the bottom, actually, we see one of those citizen juries on the use of AI in health that was in Manchester a few years ago. The Ada Lovelace Institute, that's a civil society think tank in the UK, has run what they called citizen councils on the use of biometrics data and facial recognition. At the top, we can see a picture from one of these meetings. And so, at the left, there is just kind of a tentative list of some of these recent events, but there have been many more. But we can get a sense just what issues were addressed here, but maybe some of the goals, perhaps, what terminologies were used. Sometimes also who organized them, often larger think tanks, sometimes actually with the involvement of public opinion companies and so on, sometimes civil society organizations, even activist organizations. So, can these practices advance participation in decision-making about data and AI? Do they re-establish a kind of citizens' agency? Are they useful for, let's say, for us to get back on top of what is used, for what purposes it is used, to kind of draw boundaries, to maybe provide guidance for the use of also communicative AI, as well as data uses and so on. Well, here are just a few snapshots from our research. One point that we were very interested in is whether people are able to, ordinary citizens as they called, to review a complex topic such as AI and discuss it and come up with useful recommendations. And the cases and interviews that we had, I think, showed that they can, especially those interviewees who organized initiatives on questions of AI, felt strongly that their experiences demonstrated that ordinary citizens without prior knowledge were able to develop thorough outcomes and relevant policy recommendations. Of course, they would say that, but we could see that there were some interesting outcomes and so interesting catalogs of guidance and policy recommendations. What decision-making power do they have? What type of participation are we actually talking about? Is there an actual power shift, or is it about cooptation and legitimation? Is there a risk of what some have described as engagement washing or participation washing, creating the illusion of participation and engagement to justify and legitimize policy decisions? Well, we have to recognize, first of all, that most of these initiatives are deliberative and not about sharing power. People can discuss, people can give advice, not, in most cases at least, decide. The final decision-making power is typically not handed over to citizens. Sometimes it's actually rather about finding out about people's preferences and perspectives, like a poll or a focus group. But we found there is often a genuine motivation of engaging citizens and advancing the voices of citizens, and the outcomes can have at least normative power in affecting decision-making. That compromised decision-making power is also related to the fact that, well, citizen assemblies, citizen juries, public dialogues, and so on, according to this mini-publics model, are often commissioned by government or larger think tanks and run by agencies that specialize in public opinion, as I already said, or in facilitation of larger events. They're often not self-organized grassroots events run by citizens whose voices should be amplified, and there's a tension, therefore, then at the very core of these mechanisms. And it has an impact also on the question of how is the debate framed? Is there a bias towards a particular conclusion? Or how is this bias avoided, perhaps? Is there, for example, is the value of data assumed from the outset, and is that given as a starting point for participants? And several of the events that we looked at actually did start out highlighting the value of data. The main goal seemed to be, in their own words sometimes, to maintain public confidence, to build public trust, to respond to possible concerns. This would mean that some of them were actually biased from the outset, yes. And there was often also little possibility for participants to define the agenda, to move the goalposts of the debate, and so on. And so unsurprisingly, the results of many of these events supported the wider use of data and AI. Not always, not all the events were like this, but it's certainly an area of concern. And there is a further, there's a further tension between the established structures of mini-publics and they're often recruited through random sampling or they have the goal to represent society more widely. And then the effects of datafication that I mentioned earlier, the inequality in how people are affected by datafication. Most of our interviewees actually felt that marginalized and particularly affected communities need to be prioritized in these exercises. It's important to have people there from impoverished, racialized, other communities, and to highlight their experiences. One interviewee said, participation is enough, is not enough. you also need inclusion. And this questions in a way the whole model of mini publics, which is aimed at representing a cross-section of society. At least when we talk about AI, at least when we talk about questions of data, then we may need to think differently about that. A few brief snapshots just from interviews with participants. Well, those that we asked, and we're still working on that, on the one hand, said that they felt empowered through this exercise because they advanced their understanding of the issues, and they also thought they could have an impact on how data and AI are being discussed, and maybe also how they are regulated. And at the same time, then there's we could question that a little bit, because while these participants felt that at the time, when we asked them about how this affected the rest of their lives or their engagement after the event, there wasn't that much change, right? And so you can certainly question what has the change been? Has it been so dramatic? But this is, as I said, something that we're still working on, something that we're still trying to find out. And again, we saw not a lot of representation of marginalized and specifically impacted communities. And that was certainly an area of concern. Okay, so coming towards the end, what does this mean for civic participation in governing data and AI? Well, we can look at concepts such as Arnstein's ladder, which was developed in the context of city planning, and ask where we stand along the extreme positions of full citizen power at the top and participation washing, maybe as it would be called today, at the bottom. We may be somewhere in the upper middle range. Arnstein discussed a form of participation that includes an advisory role called this placation. Might fit to some of these initiatives. Pateman, in earlier work on participation, talked about partial participation. So that, as such, is not exactly revolutionary. But what our research shows is still that these initiatives and experiments, in most cases, actually there are experiments, is that they show us that there is a wide recognition of an accountability problem, maybe, with data and AI systems. And, well, from our perspective of living in the UK, we might say that if even the current UK government supports some of these practices, then that would reflect probably a strong pressure on them to do something about this problem. And and there are efforts and possibilities to advance more participatory and democratic mechanisms, even in the context of increasing automation. And what I think the research also has shown is that we need to take into account the specific ways in which different communities and different societal actors, social actors are affected by datafication and by the use of AI. So we need, in a way, new models, different models and practices to account for the uneven impacts of datafication and to enable affected communities to have a greater voice. And that means, we probably need to go beyond classic models of mini publics and invent new practices in a way. And that might also, need to complement these models with specific spaces for affected communities. When the Ada Lovelace Institute held their citizen councils, they did that. They had separate spaces, additional spaces, which were dedicated to the voices of affected communities. Or it might mean to go back to established practices of multi-stakeholder policy making, which have often been criticized, rightly so, but might tell us something about the importance of involving those in the debate who have a particular stake in the issue. And this then also points us perhaps to another structural problem with these initiatives. They seek to assemble individuals. And so it is about the participation and involvement and agency also of individuals. And that's fine, but it reflects, we might say, the broader societal effect of datafication, the individualization of societal problems, right? In datafied societies, the individual is the main unit of concern and also the main remedy, like, for example, individual life circumstances in a house may raise the risk of a fire breaking out, and may lead then the fire brigade to target that household with information to prevent a fire. That's an example from London. That's actually what they do there, based on a kind of a very detailed focus on the living conditions in different specific houses, sometimes also streets and so on. And it might be useful, but it means the focus then is not on housing problems, on broader societal questions, on the governmental level perhaps, but it's always broken down to the individual. And a participatory structure that focuses on individuals may also struggle in addressing this broader problem. Now, these are just some thoughts and considerations at the end, and these are areas that I and others at the lab will continue working on. And now, in a way, yes, I already said that before, we ended with some, we might say, hardcore political science and moved away quite a bit from the initial consideration and also concern with questions of communicative AI. But yes, I hope that can be a contribution to thinking about the societal context of communicative AI and how to address them. We can certainly ask the question, should we have a citizens' jury on the use of ChatGPT? Should we have one at university? I don't know, maybe that's already happening. Will be interesting to hear your ideas about this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's very interesting because when we started our research and on how government, we focus on local government, but also other areas of government in the UK, use data for the delivery of public service or for kind of understanding their citizenry better and so on for different purposes. That was a few years ago, and a lot of that was happening on a very experimental basis, and we could see that actually one local council didn't really know what the next one was doing and what the next one is doing, and they were all they had the kind of maybe the feeling or the kind of the obligation to use data more, but they weren't really sure what to use, and there was a lot of experimentation from some of these authorities on what systems they use, to what extent, in what ways, and so on. We had a workshop at some point a few years ago that was very interesting, where we brought some of them together, and it was useful for it was interesting for them also, because for some of them it was the first time that they heard about what other local authorities were doing. Now, and in part that then also led to some of them canceling some of these systems and these uses again, because it didn't really do what they were hoping to get out of it. And so I think we've seen a kind of a very experimental process over the years in which different organizations have tried out different things and then learned from others, exactly as you say, and then or if I understand correctly. And then there is more of a convergence in a way on what data is used, from what sources, for what purposes. I think there's still a lot of back and forth going on. I mean, I mentioned that briefly, but our lab member Joanna Red in particular, she did this project on cancelled systems and looking at data use and local authorities in different places around the world, and looking particularly at all the instances where data systems, sometimes AI systems, were used and then were stopped again because they only created harm rather than anything else. But I think, yeah, we're in a process in which also different organizations learn from each other, and that is, yeah, that's an interesting process. And what they should also do, of course, and that kind of goes more into the direction of what I was talking about, is kind of they should learn from each other, obviously, yes, but also from citizens and from the people that are affected by these systems. And that is not happening so much yet, although, as I mentioned, we're also in a phase of experimentation there. But where this is going, we'll see. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a key tension, right? Also in areas of what some have focused on for the past few years, or for the past decade in a way, on what's been called data activism, and that has included, in a way, different strands. And one is the productive and empowering use of also data, sometimes the collection of data about, for example, environmental change, and to make that usable for citizens and for kind of make it part of broader public campaigns for environmental change and so on. And there have been many examples that have been very, very interesting. And at the same time, yes, that also means that you become, if you're engaging on that level, you become more visible with all the data that we produce. Of course, you become more visible to the state and various actors. You become like not just identifiable, but you kind of contribute to this process of categorization, of assessment, and all these things. And so there's another strand of data activism, which is about campaigning around these issues, for example, against surveillance. But yeah, all these things are sometimes quite in tension, in a tension. But yeah, another tension, actually, thinking about data justice, is that part of, some concerns around datafication have been, for example, with regards to discrimination, have been about highlighting the discriminatory uses of certain data systems, which then leads to the call for improving them, of course, yeah. But then another aspect of data justice is actually then to focus less on the actual technology and to focus less on the actual data system, and ask more about the societal context, in which context, political system, for which political purposes, and so on, is a data system used. And yeah, I don't have an exact answer to this, but I mean, you identified some of these tensions that are there, and that are constantly being debated. Some colleagues have a few years ago formed this term of decentering data, which addresses this concern that when we critique data collection, data analysis, data use, also in AI systems and so on, we often focus very much on the technology, whereas decentering data, what we should not forget, and according to some, what we should focus on much more, is the societal context. For what purposes are they used? Could the same purposes be achieved without the data uses? Are the purposes wrong? Who benefits from this? And these classic questions, in a way. I think what is happening in debates around data activism, data justice, and so on is we've seen some productive conversations between these different approaches. And when I think about, for example, one of the journal special issues or several that we put together, they included these different perspectives. They included articles on how people collected data specifically for campaign purposes, or data about human rights violations, data about environmental degradation and so on, in order to make that visible and to work with that and to use that also for campaigning and for progressive purposes and so on. At the same time, also then other approaches in the same collection of articles that highlight the problems of the more kind of fundamental problems of this data focus. And I think we've seen some interesting, I wouldn't say we should do one but not the other. I think all these approaches are interesting and relevant, but to have this productive conversation, I think is quite useful, yeah. No, I mean, there are so many, I mean, this connects also, any of these debates connect so many different issues, right? From surveillance studies and the concerns there around the panopticon and so on to, of course, communicative AI, which kind of goes through several steps in between, right? And kind of just thinking about how to, also how to connect them. But yes, and people's knowledge and understanding, and based on that, then people's responses to that. That's a key aspect that also, as I said, is a starting point for some of this work and this interest. And I think, there has been work on there has been, of course, the popular kind of assumption that people don't care, otherwise they wouldn't share so much on social media. That was kind of then refuted many times by scholars analyzing kind of this I don't care attitude in a little bit more detail, and then say, well, it's not really that people don't care, it's more like they are powerless, they feel powerless, maybe feel that too much data is collected, too much data is used and analyzed in a certain way and then used for other purposes that we don't know about. And and then there's a powerlessness, a kind of, and therefore based on that, a lack of engagement, more of a resignation, as we've heard in that one from that one concept, digital resignation, and that has been analyzed to some extent, and from surveillance studies, we've had concepts such as the chilling effect, so that people actually are more cautious about doing what they do online, for example, for example, writing online what they actually think. That has been a strong concept, although difficult to prove. And I think what we've seen is kind of that most of us, I guess, are in this state in which we know that a lot of data is collected, used for all kinds of purposes. We don't really know how, we don't really know what, and we kind of don't feel many other possibilities than to just go on with our lives and maybe not be happy about it, but do stuff anyway online. And I think that's probably the predominant characterization, predominant implication and practice. We've seen in some cases when there were big scandals, like 10 years ago, of course, Snowden, but then also other major scandals of data collection and analysis. And in the meantime, that these were some moments then when this came more to the forefront, and also more information was shared. But then some of this dies down again, and kind of we go back to normalization in a way. But what we can see is that some of the recent policy developments, particularly then GDPR as one of the kind of fundamental frameworks there have tried to address some of that, right? Have tried to give people more rights to inquire about their data and at the same time limit some of the data uses, some of the data collection. And again, that reflects concerns. And yeah, I think we're in this situation, right, in which we have to go on with our lives, but at the same time, there are concerns. We see that reflected in policy. Some of that has been included in the recent AI Act, although to different extent, perhaps. But yeah, I'm kind of going into different directions here, and maybe I should stop. But yeah, certainly these are some of the broader debates that we should continue. Yeah, and this actually, I mean, again, there are lots of different dimensions. The case is very interesting of a large private data operating company that has some connections with the far right and in the US and so on, but also military contractors and so on. And then being tasked to provide data infrastructure for that of the NHS, which is the national health system in the UK, and then there have been debates around how what the implications might be, because supposedly they don't have access directly to patient data, but then again they create the infrastructure on which patient data is created in the first place and shared and processed and so on, which then has perhaps much deeper implications than on the health sector and the health system in the UK. That points to the question also, who is contracted to, or what kind of companies are contracted, and maybe that's kind of the broader context here, to provide services, to provide infrastructures and services on data and on AI in some cases, and what is happening at this moment of contracting private, subcontracting private, or buying private services and infrastructures for that. And that is a moment where some have suggested a lot more intervention, participation could actually happen at the moment at which the state or a public institution creates an agreement with a private service provider. That is something certainly where some intervention could happen, could be useful. Also some general guidelines and norms on what such contracting should include. And so there's some work, there's some suggestions on what that could include. I mean, it's certainly like, it's a part of, it's kind of a specific suggestion actually that some have raised, also civil society organizations, that more could happen exactly at that point where government institution typically does not create a data system on its own, but then procures systems and services from other from other partners, from other providers. And there isn't, I mean, there are a few suggestions, there are a few practical examples, I think not so much from the data and AI sphere, but there have been suggestions on, I don't know if you know more about that, but there have been suggestions on what to do there to create much stricter guidelines on what private companies should provide, how they should do that, how the data should be used, and also involve people in these decisions. Yeah, and that's the particular problem NHS data in the UK, and the context there is, as always, a more kind of a broader political debate, and a kind of an agenda by some to privatize the health system, which is public at the moment, and a privatized data infrastructure would certainly be something that leads towards that goal, and of course that's also a political context that we have to see here. But it is a good example, yes, for the privatization certainly of key infrastructure for data. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and you're right. I mean, the way I use it here, the borders are a bit porous. Yes, absolutely, and I think because like on the one hand, I want to, I try to in a way connect with what we've been doing and with our work at the lab with some of these debates that are taking place elsewhere and here also particularly, and to try to draw some of these connections. And they're very tentative, of course. And this is exactly something that would be also, of course, then interesting to discuss further and to hear about further suggestions about that. But yeah, the point here was to use that in a broader framework that points to the societal dimension and from kind of the individual engagement. I think the debate around communicative AI has been also about like spreading out to societal concerns and address those. And yeah, basically the question or the experiment here was then to see to what extent this work that we've been doing on data use and AI use in the public sector can be connected to this debate. But as I said, I'm interested to hear more about this. Yeah. Yeah, that's also an interesting interesting debate, and there are a number of tensions at the heart of this idea of digital citizenship, right? And as I kind of just very briefly outlined, and they concern the question of where what the implications are, where power lies, and so on, and what we focus on, of course, and which actors or which structures we focus on. I think it is still useful to think about what this concept and what the different practices can, how they can help us understand what is happening, but also how they can help us create ways forward in this changing context, in the transforming context in which we are which, let's say, our role as active citizens is more and more compromised or challenged through the ways in which processes between state and citizens are automated, and the ways in which we are assessed, and so on. So I think there was an earlier point around data activism, or that I framed according to data activism. Certainly, there are many practices that show us interesting ways forward of working with data for all kinds of purposes, and for kind of going in different directions than a more kind of neoliberal understanding of citizenship, of smart citizenship, as that was called. But I think we need to be aware of the challenges, and what I kind of pointed out with regards to digital citizenship was that very often we've seen maybe overly enthusiastic accounts of where that leads us, what that helps us, with not enough attention to the context and structures within it takes place, and within which citizen acts and using digital tools also takes place. And yes, and I think we need to be aware of these of these issues. But I think it's I mentioned some examples. I still think there are some very interesting uses also with regards to data that are not that kind of point at least a little bit away out of this restricted neoliberal smart citizen context. Yeah, that's a good point. And so far, what we've been looking at is kind of public institutions, right? But not private institutions. And there we have a different scenario. And it would be an interesting next step to see how maybe user participation, maybe producer participation, and so on can actually happen also in a privatized production context. But that is a different beast, right? That is a different context, and there maybe from a data justice perspective not so much, because it just shows us of course there are a lot of other things to consider. And you mentioned unions and so on, and we kind of have to look at it from a broader social and political perspective, and not just from a data perspective. And so that is definitely something interesting to address. And when we think about what I said at the end, like should there be a citizen jury about ChatGPT? That kind of raises the question about how it is produced, created, about the kind of the data and the training data, about the kind of the code. Is it about the uses, the applications in certain private sector contexts, or in certain government contexts, or in kind of the general societal context? These would be then important questions there. What do we focus on? And because it's difficult to grasp these issues in a private sector context, I mentioned the whole issue of procurement earlier, because that is a moment when a privately produced technology then becomes, in a way, public technology if it's used and applied by the public sectors. Then maybe we have a better justification for public engagement and citizen participation at this point. But yeah, it shouldn't stop there. You're totally right. But yeah.
Well, I can link this quite well to the question I have. These are two things. So one thing is when it comes to participation. Well, this is a term which is around in media and communications for 30 years, and it's always framed as the answer. Participation, political communication, participation when it comes to data justice, and so on and so on. The question I would want really to ask is this really always the solution? Or put it the other way around, you cannot force somebody to participate. And who does take part in such juries? It's academics, it's people from very particular backgrounds, and it's for sure not what we understand as the everyday citizen, because he or she normally is not interested in issues like that. They are quite abstract issues. So the question I'm posing really here is, what idea of participation do you exactly have, and how far can a concept of participation help us when it comes to issues like, I don't know, Communicative AI, ChatGPT, or whatever? So in what should they participate? Is it about building up a chatbot for city government in Bremen? There I can imagine, we can have a participatory board. But what do they discuss? Normally they complain about administration. And normally you get from there some kinds of information how you could organize or build up a chatbot. But typically they do not come to a bigger question. So this is one group of questions. What does participation mean in particular, and how far does it take, or can it bring us? And the other point is, it's more abstract, and but I think a very crucial issue if we're talking about, let's say, all the tech industries which is behind that development. And this is the question: does our idea of, on the one side, a state, and on the other side, a private companies really work? So these are entangled. These are closely entangled. Most of the developments you have in so-called private companies started with state funding or state-funded research, and the lines in between are blurred for a very long time, at least from my point of view. And therefore, the question I have is, when we're really talking about technologies in these kinds of societies we have nowadays, shouldn't we move forward in our thinking about governance at that point? Question mark. So these are the 2 points. Basically, the 2 crucial concepts: governance and participation.
Yeah, but if and the point about the entanglement of state and business and so on is totally true. But then it actually means that there could be, right from the outset, more clearer guidelines towards also the production and the invention and the innovation and all that, right? And so that of course is a kind of contrasts very, very strongly with the ethos of innovation that has been predominant in the tech sector, of just act fast and break things. And this means if we're thinking about public involvement in developing like guidelines for the development and innovation of these things, that would be very much the opposite of like fast and break things. So how does that relate to each other? But if we're interested in that, in having a wider societal discourse around that, what should be and how it should be innovated and what should be developed into for what goals and so on, certainly also the fact that a lot of it started with public funding should give us a good, useful justification. Now, the question of is participation always the answer? No, it's probably not. But I think my starting point was, first of all, like the claim that there is a democratic problem, that there is something that is increasingly and very strongly transforming societies and transforming state-citizen relations and so on, but doing so in a very obscure way. So we don't know how the classic black box problem, we don't know what data is collected for what purpose, how it affects public service provision, for example, and so on. And so then the question is, so what should we do? What other ways are there to actually address this problem? Should there be an imperative for participation? No. Yeah, sure. That's and for engagement, yes, certainly not. And that's an important point. But kind of the starting point was that there is a deficiency of that. And so the goal is perhaps not that everything, every use of every technology, every development of every technology should be accompanied by a citizen assembly. But I think it is useful to think about how we can address this democratic problem and how we can advance public concerns or provide new avenues also for public concerns in this field. And that's where I'm coming from. But I think you had a point on that, didn't you? Maybe in some cases, but not in other cases, because some of the institutional structures that have been discussed around data stewardship and data trusts and so on, kind of address these questions of like, or the kind of, let's say, the need of to take data and data analysis out of the hands of private actors and to involve the people whose data is collected and is used in decision making about these users. Not in all cases, but then there are some of these, like data co-ops and so on, where that is included. So there are some overlaps of these debates. I don't think it's an either or, because the debates that you can have or sometimes do have, and some kind of in a citizen jury on the use of data is, of course, also then, or does not always, but might in some cases involve and include the question of like data control and data. I mean, it is essentially about data control, right? And who has control over the data, and that is, or kind of not always, but should then, we might say, be part of that conversation. No, I mean that's a good question, and certainly there are many, and we've had many critiques of some of these events that we looked at, where only very specific questions were discussed, and they did not go to the core of who owns and uses and so on what data, but potentially in other cases they do, and
Thanks a lot for coming to Bremen and giving your presentation here.